Thanks for all taking the time to participate in this talk. As you know, the topic of the talk is called metabolic thinking. And we are all here because we are all part of the book. And this was a special initiation with Food Culture Days to we are all here. We're all part of the book, and this was a special initiation with Food Culture Days to. Hang on one second. Let me see why there's an echo. Do you guys hear an echo?
I did. It's gone now.
Okay. All right. So yeah, we're gonna use the book as a catalyst to start thinking about metabolic thinking and how we each explore food as a tool for social change. So to start, I just wanted to introduce myself and the book. My name's Grace. I'm an artist, and I work in collaboration with many people, but specifically with farmers for a project that I'm here at Food Culture Days doing called Oral, in which I create a sonic cartography of different actions in cultivation and cooking, and really understanding how listening can be a pedagogical tool. And so for this piece, this dialogue, I wanted to ask each of you to introduce yourself and also the term that you made a selection for in the book. And then we can go from there to start thinking about metabolic thinking and have a few other questions. So we're supposed to use, for the dialogues, we're supposed to use like a talking tool. So I'm just gonna grab, basically, if you want to talk, you put something to the center and that indicates, that's how we sort of orchestrate the different voices and the different talks. So basically, if you feel like you have something to say, you pick an object that is going to be your symbol for your voice wanting to be heard, and you can place it in the center and then put it back when you're done. So that's sort of just a little choreography of how the dialogue is planned. And so yeah, if you want to take a minute to get your your talking tool. Yeah, wow, cool. That's a good one. And then an iron. Wow, Aziz. Amazing. So yeah, if anyone, I'll just also introduce the book first for those who are watching. The book is called In, From, and With, Exploring Collaborative Survival. And it is a book that was inspired by Anna Singh's Mushroom at the End of the World, in which she brings up this notion of collaborative survival. And in the book, it's unraveled in more of like a forest concept and how different ecologies relate, and using the Matsutake mushroom as a case study. And I decided to apply this notion of collaborative survival to how we cultivate our food and how we relate to our peripheral environments. And I invited 24 contributors, which 5 of you are here, and delighted to be here with you guys. And there's a lexicon from A to Z, and each person picked a different term that felt pertinent to this subject matter, and then created a definition and also an invitation to embodiment. So the book is full of exercises and edible recipes, non-edible recipes, walks, all sorts of activities, and really trying to engage in embodiment, pedagogical embodiments. So yeah, that's what I'll say about the book. It just came out, and will also be available at Food Culture Days little bookshop. So yeah, that's about it. If anyone wants to begin by introducing themselves, their practice, and also their term in the book. I put the talking stick back.
Can anyone hear? Can you guys hear me? Hi, my name is Sarah Grayrock. I'm an artist and student and mental health support worker, and I'm currently based on the beautiful land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, also known as Vancouver. So I'm here chatting with you guys, energized by the moon right now, which is like pretty cool. And my word that I worked with in Grace's lovely book is intra-action.
Hi, I'm Sean Roy. I'm an English artist and environmental educator, currently based in rural Derbyshire on a residency in an old Steiner school where I'm learning about biodynamics. And my word in this lovely book was locality. And I wrote an instructional on non-judgmental observation. Joe, you want to go next?
Sure. Hello. My name is Joe Vavra. I'm currently in Berlin, where I'm based most of the times. I'm just about to travel to Poland, where I run a project called Leos Labs. It's an arts and ecology research platform stationary in a desert. I'm a designer, cultural ecologist. I work with building communities, experimental spaces. Part of my research is also food related. Sometimes I'm a cook, and that's how we met with Grace in Portugal. For the book, I wrote about morphic resonance, hypothesis of Rupert Sheldrake. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Hi, my name's Jessie French. I'm based on the lands of the Kulin people. We're in on Wurundjeri land right now, which is Melbourne in Australia. I specialize in bioplastic, which was my word for the book. I have a studio practice called Other Matter, which is a studio that specializes in algae-based bioplastic.
Hi, I'm Aziz. I am in Marrakesh, in Morocco right now. I run an animal sanctuary, a permaculture farm, and an artist residency, which happens to also be my home, although I split my time between Marrakesh and Verbier in Switzerland, because I also teach ethical finance at EPFL, École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. And my contribution to this wonderful book was around companion planting, which is something we practice very much here at the farm.
Thank you guys for all introducing yourself. Pleasure to have you all here and hear about the different terms. I wanted to start to open up this idea of food, working with food as a potential catalyst for social change to all of us, and sort of interpret that, see how we interpret that within our own practice. I think that it has a lot of potency to be political with the way you eat and what you choose to consume, and our stance as a consumer is becoming increasingly more of a necessity to pay heed to. And I just wanted to ask you, all of you have quite different practices with food, and I really wanted to open it up to understand this constellation of how we all interpret foods in different contexts, whether it is as a chef or growing food or foraging food, and how also some of these might intersect. So if someone wants to just start to unfurl their practice in a social context with food, I would be happy to hear about that. So yeah.
Hi. Okay, so my first interaction with wild food was when I lived on the coast and I didn't have a job, and I just went walking every day, and I taught myself. I just got a small identification book and just taught myself all about wildflowers, and then I began to consider their nutritional, medicinal, and historical uses. And my food practice runs alongside my visual practice, and they interlink and overlap quite a lot. I ran a pay what you can cafe using surplus food in Brixton, which is a really gentrified area in South London, where a lot of people from the Windrush generation are being displaced. And so I ran this project where I worked with volunteers with learning disabilities and with mental health issues, and we just learned how to cook together and fermented loads of food. So thinking about preservation as the slowing down and warping of time, and also as a collaboration with microbes and yeasts and bacteria. And also considering the kind of access needs of people in the area. So thinking about pay what you can, or donation-based models for hospitality as a way of slowing down the sort of faceless transactions that we go through every day, and opening a conversation about alternative currencies, thinking about labor exchanges, favors, skill-based swaps. More recently, I've done a lot of work with an organization called National Food Service, which is a UK-wide constellation of projects that run social eating spaces, taking up old high street shops that have been empty, and shortening the food loop. So thinking about how we can connect with peri-urban farms and also with inner city community gardens in order to decarbonize the processes needed to get food from the soil to our plates, and also doing lots of work skilling up people in the neighborhood who want to learn how to cook in community settings. So that's not professional kitchen, that's kind of ramshackle sort of put together kitchens. Yeah, I'll let someone else talk. Thanks.
I'll pick up here because it's kind of led me to what you said, Sin. It's what led me to actually be interested in gastronomy years ago was a discovery of Pay As You Like Cafe in Amsterdam. When I first visited the city, I don't know, I was maybe 18, and it was a completely new concept for me. So it was the first experience to go to a place like this, and it completely shifted my perspective on what a cafe or a restaurant can be. And I think ever since then, I wanted to run a similar project. So yeah, that's really nice that you're doing this. Yeah, for me, well, I've been always cooking all my life. I've been quite connected with food and to all the metabolic processes and the alchemy of transformation. I think I was always fascinated by this. Some years ago, about 5 years ago, while being an interior designer in Berlin, having a studio, I got slightly burnt out of producing material objects. And I thought of another way of like delivering something to people that is a necessity. Let's say that's how I saw making food as one of the fields of product design that it's unquestionably needed. And as I knew how to cook, I thought that could be a path to follow for a while. And so I moved to Portugal and opened a restaurant, quite an experimental space, borderline art residency restaurant, where nothing was maybe as solid and as planned as in a real gastronomy. However, it did work out, and we had like a changing menu and changing chefs, and the concept was based on locality and seasonal products and experiments, and also social cooking, like cooking as means of bringing people together, which is what I'm still very interested with. Also cooking as means of collaboration and organization. Yeah, I'm also quite fascinated with fermentation and preservation of food. Yeah, what else about my food practice? It's constantly evolving. It's changing quite a lot. Last year, I started Space in Berlin, which is a combination of a workshop space and a food lab. And I've been working on the concept of opening a mushroom lab underneath our kitchen, where we would grow mushrooms and then serve them level up in the restaurant. So this is still a dream that I would like to manifest in the near future. And forging, like last year was a big forging year for me. I moved back to Berlin during the lockdown, and starting to explore every like possible edible products around the Berlin forests, and ended up again figuring out loads of new mushrooms, polypores, like the mushrooms that are living on the trees that are edible. And yeah, that's something that I would definitely want to focus more attention and learn more about, the wild plants, the flowers, herbs. Yeah, I think also from the perspective of like just being closer to another kingdom, another species. So not only from the point of consumption, but also through the consumption, we get to know other organisms, or we establish some new levels of communication. So this is also very interesting for me.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I might pick up from here because I kind of thinking about the food that we consume as like a metabolic process in itself. I've been using, I guess, substrates in the materials that I make. They utilize the waste materials from different food processes. So I did a whole series of, there were vessels that were made with the waste from a brewery. So the hops and grains, and it's still with an algal polymer, but what ends up happening is that everything, you only see those raw materials. So you can also use coffee grinds, you can use kitchen waste, and then all of the plastics that I make are also safe to eat. So I've done some experiments with eating from these things, and then I did an event with the Melbourne collaborators called Practice Studio Practice, where we actually we had plans for a gallery setting where we would have a dinner and cook down the vessels at the end of the meal to make a dessert, but it got locked down, and so we didn't get to do that. But those things will happen once again once we start opening up. We've just been cast into another lockdown this morning, so we won't be doing that for a little while. But I think thinking about the food, the processes, and the whole circle of what we have, materials that food can be transported in, can be packaged in, can be served in, that can also be eaten, if not by us, by critters in the soil or the waterways.
Okay. Well, this is all very interesting. I think my relationship with food really started as something that actually was progressive and where I learned from when I turned vegan 6 years ago, quite abruptly and mostly for ethical reasons. I then started discovering the taste of food. I think that before that I just ate to function. I remember many times my friends would say, "What do you want to eat?" And I would reply, "Food." I just didn't care what it was. And so when I turned vegan, I stopped using, sugar as well. And so I became very interested in the taste of raw food. And I became very interested in varieties of everything. And so I started collecting seeds. I collect them compulsively from all over the world. I have a big cabinet full of seeds that I cherish. And I say good morning and good night to them every day. And so these seeds allowed me to discover, for example, the taste of something like 100 different varieties of tomatoes. We have now planted something like 50 different varieties. We have close to 200 varieties of peppers that we grow here. And we don't do that commercially for the moment. I don't know really how I can monetize all this stuff, because I'm really doing it to feed myself and the people around here first. So the story of this farm really has, which I bought 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, but I would come here only once a year for 15 years. And only 5 years ago have I decided to spend more time here in Marrakesh. So I was in New York before and London before that. And so I decided to be very curious about the taste of everything raw, from radishes to everything. And so now 70% of what I eat is raw. And by selecting varieties, I realized that actually salt in a lot of those foods is superfluous, and clearly sugar is as well. I've just tasted yesterday the carrots called Blanche des Vosges, which is a French variety. It's a white carrot, like they used to be in the wild before they were transformed, and it's incredibly sweet. It's very, very sweet. It's like a fruit. And so the process here for me, it's one of connecting growing food with consuming it in a way that is as direct as possible, but also in a way where healing the soil was a huge part of our endeavor here. Because when I bought the land, it was dead. There were no trees, no plants, no wildlife, no biodiversity. There was literally nothing. It looked like Mars, and there was not even microorganisms in the soil, because it's very clayish and it's very compact. So there was so then we planted, over 20 years, we planted 5,000 trees, and then we planted an enormous amount of plants, and then we started the animal sanctuary, which creates a virtuous circle in terms of composting and, healing the soil. And so we started looking at the soil as a truly living organism that also alters the tastes of the foods that we grow. So it becomes very complex. When you start really becoming sensitive to the taste of food, we started experimenting with planting in different parts, and then feeding the soil with different types of things, like stinging nettle, fertilizer and stuff, and see the impact not only on the health of the plant, but also on the taste of the food. As you know, probably if you plant basil next to tomato, the actual tomato tastes of basil, which is kind of incredible when you think about it. And to go back to Joe, I could talk like for hours on this, but so I'm gonna try to control myself. But Joe, if you're interested in growing mushrooms, we have an underground room specifically that was built specifically for mushrooms here, so you're very welcome. It's a big project, very dear to my heart. Mushroom at the End of the World, really, that Grace mentioned, is a book that was that I was so excited to read that at the end I sent it to every single friend of mine. Sadly, none of them has read it because, unfortunately, I spent most of my life in finance and stuff, and those people just don't care about that stuff, and they got it and they were like, oh, a crazy book from Aziz again, or no interest. And so I have been miserably unsuccessful but the residents that come, the artist residents and some of the workaway or woofer people, those really have an experience here at the farm for the past 5 years, whereby they have their own vegetable garden, and whether they like it or not, they have exposure to that raw food, and and to having the olive oil from the farm and the honey from the farm, because we have beehives and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's me.
Wow, this is really inspiring. Thanks everyone for sharing. Aziz, I just started a home garden last year, and I'm just like so incredibly humbled by soil right now. But yeah, thinking about food as a catalyst for social change for me is like, comes from like a really deep desire for connection and community. And what that looks like for me right now is mutual aid, kind of like the the mutual aid that we can do through food and through sharing food and through preserving someone else's precious energy that would otherwise be used for making a meal. Yeah, removing that extra expense and thinking about how that type of care, can contribute to a lot more abundance, and again, contribute to someone's process of like really nourishing and nurturing themselves. And yeah, I think what I'm seeing for the first time ever is like mutual aid that's like with money and with, that I understand, like you need money to pay your rent, food won't pay your rent. But a friend of mine recently told me that they did feel a lot more held by being fed and attended to, as opposed to having money sent to them as an act of care. And I like to sometimes daydream about post-capitalism and thinking about a world that looks and what that looks like. And, in that world, I still see food, but I don't see money. So I don't know if that's like really a conclusion. I'm just like really in the process of thinking about all of this right now.
Just on this point about money, because I think it's important, we avoid exchanging money as much as we can here. So we started like a bartering system where whatever what we need and we don't have, for example, we don't grow cereals, but we make sourdough bread, and so we buy rye and buckwheat and things like that, and we exchange whatever we have. I mean, currently it's olive oil, but I insist with as many of our counterparties as possible to avoid exchanging money. And sometimes what it makes us do is have like an accounting mechanism whereby every month we look at whether we're positive and negative. And it's extraordinary because it has reduced the amount of exchange to such an extent that when people sometimes, when there's a little mismatch at the end of the month, the last week we just exchanged something to make it zero. And there are counterparties now, for example, for a year and a half, we have never paid them anything. They've never paid us anything. We will always find, if we're creative enough, ways to avoid any sort of money exchange.
Yeah, I've also been on a smaller scale, but I've been predominantly swapping artworks and ferments for the past 5 or 6 years. Just sending them across the world to artists and friends. And so I feel like I'm sort of part of this dark web of experimental fermenters where we sort of like pack up contraband and ship it around the world as like a towel. Yeah, it's a really for me it's hugely beneficial network to be a part of. As I already said about the Brixton pound, I'm really interested in alternative currencies and decoupling the value of food from capital, like decommodifying the raw materials, and I'm thinking quite in depth through my art practice as how to like reclaim labor from capital, considering the processes that we go through every day, and how we can not only exchange, but because I think there's something in the sort of equality there that I'm like not sure about, but definitely a form of reciprocity that I know that Robin Wall Kimmerer writes about really brilliantly, especially in an essay called The Service Berry, which just like makes me cry every time I listen to the audiobook, just walking through the forest, just having a boo. But it's a really, really beautiful text, and it's about interspecies reciprocity, and it's got me thinking a lot about bacterial collaboration and kind of the exchange that goes on there. Particularly thinking about, as Aziz was talking about, regenerating soil, but also I guess like on a smaller scale, I'm thinking about community gardens as a space for education and a space for worlding. So like Sarah was talking about, this kind of like, I think about post-capitalism a lot. Like I kind of, I guess like manifest it quite a lot, like in my practice. Like I look to construct these frameworks that can support future thinking, and it's a really, really great way of like connecting with other humans, but also connecting with our more than human friends, like plants and I've just built a wormery, and I'm just like going through the sort of fascination of that at the moment.
Okay. Something came up when you were speaking just now, Sean Roy, about reciprocity, and I was wondering. I was asking myself, how does one measure reciprocity? It can be more obvious and apparent in when working with other humans, but I was wondering, how do you guys interpret reciprocity with the non-human or bacterial communities, and how do you navigate that? I was up this morning recording at this farm. I'm in Switzerland for the Food Culture Days, and I've been working with these, they call themselves Agroecology Collective, and we were talking about how he doesn't feel like, what did he said something really funny about how his whole life is just about working for the plants. The plants basically own him, and he's now cognizant of the fact that he's under the structure of care for them, and he's like, I go out every morning and I just care for them, and I'm planting. And it's funny because a lot of people think we have dominion over plant, but actually, if we start to look at it in a different perspective, the plant world perhaps has dominion over us, or not dominion, but does have quite an imperative role. And so I wanted to just pose that question of how do you personally interpret reciprocity with the non-human, whether it's bacterial or microbial in soils, or in, because that's something that's been coming up a lot for me in my work and my research, and how to be yeah, how to pay heed to what I'm taking and consuming, even if I do it with a mindful intent. Really understanding the repercussions of what I'm taking, and especially in foraging, something like there's this notion of invasivorism, where you should only eat invasive plants as a form of getting rid of them. But it's something that I don't have answers to. I just have a lot of questions. So I wanted to, open up this notion of reciprocity with the non-human, measuring that.
So, I mean, the point about plants and our relationship with them. I mean, in Harari's book, he infamously mentioned that wheat has domesticated us, because if wheat strategy was to be propagated, they've succeeded beyond any other plant, if you think about it, because they're everywhere and they grow everywhere, and we're doing everything we can to grow more of that in horrific monoculture way. But still, if the goal of that plant was to propagate all around the world, they've succeeded very well. The way I look at reciprocity is very wide-ranging, but one example that I can think of is here, for example, is that I have 3 areas where I have a bunch of conifers, I have pine trees and things like that, and mushrooms. Every year in the fall, there's like so many mushrooms that grow there, and I have quite a few that I love and that are edible. And the idea is that if you think about building small ecosystems, you're going to and you decide to plant a certain kind of tree, and then the soil starts to change over time, and then it becomes symbiotic with, for example, a mushroom, whatever that mushroom is. What you can do as I don't know if it's reciprocity, but I'm fascinated by Paul Stamets' work on the healing properties of mushrooms, and I believe that it is one of the things that we know so little about that it is staggering. We have immense ignorance of the fungi world, which is the one that is mysterious to us, because most of the organism is underground, and the same way as we ignore a lot of things that happen in the ocean, we have this myopia and this inability to empathize or understand other. But I think that if we, for example, help mushrooms find ways to grow and multiply, and that includes damaged environments like Matsutake, we can then either have just a very, very yummy mushroom, if that's the goal, but we can also, I believe, over time discover the immense, medicinal properties of mushrooms, including in an area of mental health that we also know very little about, because a lot of those conditions are considered, because they're around the spectrum. Like, if you take depression, for example, being mildly depressed is considered as like, just snap out of it. What's your problem? The problem is if you're mildly depressed every day, it is conditioned, right? And some of the studies that are being made, some at Johns Hopkins, some at Harvard, are showing that these mushrooms can be extremely potent against alcoholism, against all sorts of conditions. And I think that once we understand mushrooms better, we will help them help us.
Yeah, I think just to echo what you said, Sean, I learned like everything I know about reciprocity from Robin Wall Kimmerer. I think she's incredible and so important. And yeah, I think that this conversation like needs to center indigeneity and indigenous land stewards. And yeah, I looking at the future, obviously, but also like considering that this is ancient knowledge.
Yeah, I completely agree. I wanted to pick up on Grace, the word dominion that you use, because it comes from this like Western Judeo-Christian history, because it's actually mentioned in the Bible in the context of the positioning of the world and everything in it as being for humans and for humans to use, and that is the set intention of the God in those religions. So I think when you start to kind of respect and acknowledge the indigenous cultures that came before, you have to also acknowledge how far that biblical tradition that we have so prevalently in the West is built up around that, and the way that the environment's being used, the way that it's being polluted, and the way that we're using energy, resources, food in ways that are unsustainable also are really linked to that. I keep going back to, there's a really interesting fact about the human body and the amount of actual human cells that we have in our body. If we were to concentrate them in one part of the body, it would be about half of one leg. So the rest of our whole bodies is actually not our cells. They're cells of bacteria, of yeasts, of other things. So I think also we need to really rethink our own positioning in this, as more of to take Lynn Margulis's term, like a holobiont, or something that is symbiotic in itself. And perhaps even terms like collaborating with parts of nature even place us outside of it. We are not outside of this system. We just live in a culture that is being positioned as outside of it for a long time.
For me, I really appreciate what you're saying there, Jesse. For me, I think about trying to develop non-verbal communication with more than humans. So using like non-judgmental observation as a technique that comes from permaculture, as a way of like encountering and existing and exploring spaces, but also as a way of like resisting the human desire to project comparisons and preconceptions onto natural places, which is kind of perpetuating the human nature dichotomy and elongating that the sort of the violence of like a blank canvas that we can just look at and project our own images onto. So for me, I'm thinking about like observing as a way of seeing how back to, for instance, in my fermentation lab, like just watching like my wines and ferments for like a long period of time is not only really useful for literally slowing down and kind of forgetting about everything, but also as a way of like connecting with them on like a labor level, and like thinking about the way that I'm constructing, like they would be working regardless whether I was there or not, but thinking about how I can support their work, whether it's the conditions that I'm creating for them, like the temperature or the sunlight or the position in the room, maybe the concentration of sugars for instance for lactobacillus to transfer into carbon dioxide and lactic acid. But yeah, that's like something that I really am I really like talking to the birds in the garden here as well. Like go out every morning, just have a chat. This robin comes and hangs out while I'm gardening, just to see if there's any worms. Like I'll chuck him a few worms, or I'll throw a few bugs. So yeah, it's for me, that's a really good way of like seeing myself as part of the ecology, seeing myself as like sort of in like unmistakably enmeshed, but also as a way of like embracing my amateurism. I wrote about that in my text actually. Like amateurism is like the ignition for adventure. So bit like not worrying about the body and just actually sort of jumping into things without too much sort of structure.
Well, one of the things, that I can think of that I was surprised about with a lot of people that come here and want to have some sort of initiation to permaculture and then growing their own food is, and that's something that I try to teach them very early, or at least guide them, is the necessity to be gentle. I think people look at farming as some sort of like macho, kind of brutal thing. They want to hit everything, break everything, and the plant, when it's taken out of a tray, there's very little regard for the root system, for the fact that it's actually a living thing. And then when we need to make space to plant something, there's no attention paid to all the insects and things that live around it and they're part of the ecosystem. So I think this relationship, like Sean was saying, in terms of the robin coming and establishing a relationship with the wildlife around us. I mean, we have a family of falcons that has a nest here for the past 8 years, and I feel like I know the mother. She comes every year, and she now has 4 babies. But I mean, you have to learn to appreciate and become very gentle with the plants, including when you prune them, including when you plant them, including when you water them, and everything. I think that's something I've learned myself, and I am trying to offer some education from that perspective.
Yeah, this is also quite interesting for me, and kind of it's a big part of my research recently. Is like how we can resensitize. So how, like, how to teach or how to share this kind of behavior that is more in the communication with the non-human. So I was very excited about about everything that's been said actually already. But yeah, like looking for these ways of broadening our perception and how we can communicate. Also trying not to look, like as Jesse said, like I think that kind of struck me like many times already, of how do we collaborate without having this notion of we're being outside of nature. So we use this like term of collaborating with nature, which we even wrote in the Grace's book as part of our collaborative contribution. And then a couple of months later, I was like, that sounds kind of strange. But along this research on perception and on more than human communication, that in my personal experience is mostly successful when I work with psychedelics. But I was really interested if this kind of connection can be established also without it. So along this research, I started working with like somatic practices, and recently I've been developing a theater piece that is based on mushroom science and like this mega science of mycology. And we tried different techniques, like more of a somatic techniques on the body and communication. So I've been working with like a theater, like a clowning technique, like mimodynamics, for example, where you embody different phenomena and different natural entities. But this is also quite interesting because the notion of mimicking is also a little bit like the notion of collaborating with nature, also kind of putting us outside of it, trying to mimic something. So yeah, I think this is just like my ongoing research. And yeah, I'm very curious if you have some other experiences with this.
I just wanted to add that I'm so inspired by somatic practice as well, but like more from like a trauma healing perspective. So I would love to like talk more about this. I know we don't have much time, but I'm really, really curious to hear more about your project and how it can all connect and how it does connect already.
Okay. I think that in the area of collaboration and in the area of you know, altering a little bit your state, and it's something that I think I've discussed a little bit with Grace in the past. I'm really in the process of experimenting with very much immersive experience, well, immersive, you know, kind of projects. The example in the book that we've showcased is one of the three sisters, you know, corn, bean, and you know, and squash, which is thousands of years old. We haven't invented anything, but the collaboration between these three plants is just so fascinating. You know, with the bean going up the stalk of the corn and the squash making sure that their wide leaves prevent too many weeds from growing, and then there is the invisible. You know, collaboration, which is underground, and that's the one that I'm truly fascinated by. I think it's you know, I have a little lab here. I spent a lot of time looking at things and reading things, but I think that's great. In order to connect that with a human experience for people who are not, I would say, you know, who have less interest in these matters, what I tried to do is create an experience that is as immersive as possible by having a meal prepared. But first we harvest, and if we're not harvesting everything at the same time, some of it might be stored or fermented, whatever. And then so we first discuss the origins of the plants and their varieties. And then people get surprised when I say, you know, how many varieties of corn there are, that kind of stuff. And I explain where the seeds are from. They're ancient seeds. They come from Mexico, etc., etc. And then the recipe. The recipe is also a way to do some fairly gentle education, culinary education. We're saying, you know, this is a very ancient recipe, and this is how we need to prepare these things. And it can go very far. It can go from, you know, if you're barbecuing thing, explaining to people how you create charcoal. We make our own charcoal here, so we you know, it's a fairly simple process. And so what I would like to add to that is, you know, some sort of, you know, music that's very that allows people to really also be maybe more knowledgeable about those cultures that first domesticated those plants and created beautiful recipes with them, etc., etc. So I think a way to maybe instill change and have people being maybe more mindful is to go way beyond the consumption or just the simple recipe which people typically download, and then they start automatically, you know, creating things, which, you know, Sean was mentioning being an amateur. I would rather make mistakes while cooking something without reading a recipe and then adjust for it or whatever myself, even if I have a bad meal sometimes, but or a bad tasting meal. But I really think that if people start having some more hand-holding about, you know, the food itself, where the recipe is from, it's a way to maybe travel It's a way to learn more about the culture and the richness of the culture, the music, the folklore, even the costumes and things like that. And that's something we're hoping to promote further here at the center.
Yeah, I really enjoy that point, Aziz, about intuitive cooking. I think like I'm a self-taught cook and fermenter, so it's for me it's less about recipes, which I find can be quite exclusive and difficult to follow. I think the language used is yeah, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of following recipes. So I'll scan like 3 and I'll just like mash them together. And yeah, since I went on a fermentation masterclass with Sandor Katz in Tennessee, I went to his house in 2019 and we did an amazing retreat with him. And my approach to cooking is like totally changed. But I think that's another conversation. What I wanted to say was just on the note of collaborating, and which kind of positions ourselves outside of the ecologies, which I really appreciate, but also as an artist who works predominantly on skill-based and communication workshops. I guess something that I'm planning at the moment is to do a project in Liverpool as part of the biennial, which we are going to intercept food waste from landfill, and then we're gonna basically it's like embodied learning. We're gonna like pretend we're gonna mimic bacteria, and so the whole project is about like humans as a processing medium, and it's skill-based learning about how to actually break down gluts and distribute and preserve foods. And then at the end of it, we're going to like do a big cook-off, and all the people who live in the area are going to like bring their scraps, their veggie scraps that they've collected, and we're going to start a compost pile, and then they get to share some food in this like amazing overgrown garden that we're also going to trim back. So I think there is something there that I want to develop in my practice about actually connecting on a deeper level with non-humans, but also I think in terms of like writing and delivering projects that are for people who maybe have a surface level or like a home base interest in cooking or in food, and actually like trying to develop a narrative around the non-human species and what they actually do, what bacteria actually does. Like we kind of assume that it's dirty, but obviously it's in us, it is us. And so for me, like trying to illustrate that through skill-based learning is hopefully going to be a way of like not only reducing the amount of food waste that people go through at home, but also opening their eyes up to the way that these animals, if you like, live kind of in our gut, on the outside of every single thing that we put in our mouths.
Well, thank you, everyone. I would love to keep going, but unfortunately, we have a time constraint. Yeah, I just want to thank you all for being part of this conversation. There's a lot of things that stem from this that I've been thinking about, and I hope that we can continue the conversation. There'll be another conversation for the book, a sort of a different lens, different perspective, through Inland, which is the urban shepherding project in Spain. So I'll send you guys all an invite for that. And just want to say thank you all so much for being here. Really, it's funny, I wrote a question that I didn't get to, but in the end, I feel like we arrived to it anyways. And I was thinking about how the mind, the metaphor parallels between the mind and the stomach. And I sort of feel like we acted as a digestive system collectively to really kind of break down these things, and just want to, yeah, acknowledge that and thank you. So see you all in other forms of the internet.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was very inspiring, and maybe internet is great, but real life meeting would
Yeah.
also be something.
That'd be great.
Ciao.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.